All right, I will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us on this fine Wednesday evening. My name is Albany. I'm an Environmental Programs Associate for the City of Sunnyvale, and I'm excited to help host this webinar tonight with our lovely guest, Juanita Salisbury. So I'm going to go over just a couple quick housekeeping things. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So first of all attendees are muted by default just to reduce the background noise in the presentation. We'll be pausing at the end of the webinar to go over questions. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function instead of the chat. So at the end, I'll go through some of those questions, and then I'll also provide an opportunity for people to raise their hands and ask questions live to Juanita. So like I said, please use the chat, or please use the Q&A instead of the chat. And then just so you know, the webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on the BOSCA website. So you can check in on that in a couple of days if you want to rewatch anything or check back in on some resources that we'll be mentioning. Next. All right, so a little bit about BOSCA. BOSCA is a special district that represents 26 cities, water districts, and private water companies, all of which purchase water wholesale from the San Francisco Regional Water System. The BOSCA member agencies provide water to 1.8 million people and over 40,000 businesses and community organizations in Alameda, Santa Clara, and San Mateo County. And the BOSCA goal is to provide high quality water at a fair price. Next. So consistent with that goal, just a second. So outdoor water use represents the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation in the BOSCA service area here. And outdoor water use reduction through the use of water efficient plants and innovative techniques, such as those that we'll be talking about today, can help conserve water and ensure the future water supply needs of our community are met. Next. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just to highlight some additional ways to save water in Sunnyvale and in our area in general. So we have the Landscape Rebate Program, which offers rebates for replacing lawns and plants that require a lot of water with drought-tolerant plants or permeable hardscape. And then there's also a gray water program that we have for our residents. So properties that connect a clothing washer to a gray water irrigation system are eligible for a rebate of up to $200 just for taking advantage of your gray water. And I'll drop a link in the chat in just a minute with some more resources for these two. Next. Residents in our area are also eligible to take advantage of the Lawn Be Gone program, which, as the name implies, helps you earn rebates of up to $4 per square foot of lawn that you replace with some beautiful drought-tolerant landscape instead of lawns. And on the topic of lawns, I know a lot of us are going to be doing some spring gardening here in the next couple weeks and months. And if anyone is in need of any compost, residents in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Palo Alto can all stop by the Sunnyvale Smart Station and pick up compost, organic compost, for free. And all you have to do is bring your own container, and it's as easy as that. And I'll also drop a link in the chat with the link to the Smart Station. And then next, as we all know, these last couple weeks in the Bay have been a little bit rainy, more so than usual. And actually, you can easily capture that rainwater and use it to water your garden or your lawn throughout the whole year. And so there's also a couple really useful rainwater rebates for rain barrels. Next. And then finally, BOSCA has a couple new programs that we just want to share with you. There's a Smart Sprinkler Controller Rebate and Installation Program. And there's also a new revamped landscape program that includes additional rebates for stormwater retention features. So if either of those sound of any interest to you, then you can find more information on the BOSCA website at bayareaconservation.org. Next. All right, and this is one of the first Bosco workshops of the season. So if you're interested in learning more about landscaping, gardening, water efficiency, and more, then this is a quick snippet of the schedule of upcoming classes. And you can also find this on the Bosco website, of course. And also more resources are available at bayareagardening.org. You can find a lot about different plants, water efficiency, landscaping, and more. So that's a great resource as well. All right, and that's it for me. I am going to pass it off to Juanita for the rest of our evening. Like I said, drop your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll pause at the end and we'll be able to answer whatever questions you have. So Juanita, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Albany. So tonight I'm going to be talking about native plants and pollinator gardens. I'm Juanita Salisbury, as I said before, and I do have a doctorate in biological psychology, which I studied ingestive behavior, that is eating and drinking, and I also have a degree in landscape architecture. So my work now combines these two disciplines, and I provide food for insects at the base of the food chain. And I do take care of some pollinator gardens here in Palo Alto. We are the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And as well, I have a channel on YouTube, Primrose Way, which I show some of the various techniques I use. The gardens that we have here in Palo Alto, they're always open. They're on public land. The first garden that we did was the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden. These are in Palo Alto. This is Embarcadero Road here. There's the Gwynda Street Pollinator Garden, the Hopkins Avenue Pollinator Garden, Arcadia Place, and then Island Drive Pollinator Garden. And these gardens all feature California native plants. So if you need to see how they look in their natural environment, how big they get, what colors they look like, and all that during the year, it's a great little loop. If you like to do the walking, you can walk this loop, this route. And I usually walk up Channing and do a loop that way. And that's about 3 miles. But they're, especially the Primrose Garden right now is super blooming with poppies. So I recommend going out and taking a look at that if you have an opportunity. So tonight I'm going to talk about a little bit about design process because when we're installing pollinator gardens and native plant gardens, we have to really think about function and what kinds of decisions we make about what plants we put in and how to make the best decisions possible. So the broad topics first, I'm going to talk about the basics of native plant landscape design and what that really means. And second, I'll talk about how to lay out your landscape. And I'll assume that you're starting from scratch, but you know, if you're not starting from scratch, you can just skip some of the steps. Basic planting design, what's involved with deciding what to plant, and also developing a plant palette, kind of like a paint palette where you use different colors. This is a palette of plants, and considering those as colors that you spread across the canvas. And then lastly, because these are native plants and you're providing food for pollinators, they're different than other kinds of gardens, I think. There are some different behaviors that are involved in terms of taking care of them because of what the plants do in terms of their function in the environment. So I'll be talking about what are some of the maintenance and irrigation considerations. These are sort of the moving into the future once you're installed, and how you take care of it. And on my slides, I also like to showcase different plants with different pollinators of pictures I've taken myself. I also do a lot of documenting of the species that I see in the garden, so I know that these are successful and are running optimally for species to be provided for. So let's talk about plants. Plants are the beginning of everything. So plants are the primary producers of food and the basis of the food chain. So we get energy from the sun. coming down, it's converted by the plants into food that is then eaten by other things, insects like this big fat caterpillar here. And then those insects are protein for other animals further up the food chain, like birds. In fact, you need about 70% native plants in your yard to sustain populations of chickadees. They don't get enough protein otherwise. 37% of animal species are plant-eating insects. So as a rule, you have native insects only eating the native plants that they evolved with. The chemical specificity is very tight with these plants. So native plants get eaten by native insects. Non-native plants will not feed the native insects that are already here, which is why I design exclusively with them. And pollinators, their role, their function in the grand scheme of things here is that by transferring pollen between flowers, pollen is the male genetic code that's transferred over to the female part of the flower. The function of a pollinator then is to spread genes around in the environment. And what that does is it makes a diverse environment for other plants. And then those plants are then available for the other things that eat the plants in the environment. So while plants are decorative, they're pretty, they're fragrant, they're colorful, they have all of these attributes, they have beautiful textures and so forth, they're not really decorations, they're food. This is their actual function in the environment, their biological function. Plants are food. So what it means, and this is key, when you plant native plants, is that you will have native insects eating your plants. But that is what you want, okay? That's a good thing. Native plants will attract many native pollinators, which is great because they'll spread the genes around, but then you'll have insects and caterpillars like this larva here that will later turn into a butterfly. So you should expect and definitely want to see your plants being eaten. That way you know that your pollinator garden and your native plant garden is actually functioning as it was meant to. And this plant actually is Malacathamus fasciculatus, wonderful evergreen shrub with beautiful pink blossoms. I would say it's very decorative, but it's also very yummy. So, but why is it so important to see native plants as food? If you think about food, imagine setting a buffet table and then killing all of your guests who come for dinner. You want to avoid that. Because these plants will attract a variety of native pollinators and other insects. You don't want to create an ecological sink, that is, or a trap that traps insects. And that's something that insects are attracted to, and then they get killed by increased predation or something else in the environment that reduces their reproductive success. An example of that is there are pollinators that work at night. Moths and other insects are attracted to light, and light pollution is a big issue for insect diversity. Something easy that you can do because you will have these insects in your yard is to put your outdoor lights on motion sensors and to use blackout curtains or put blackout fabric in your windows at night to cut down on light pollution and make your yard as dark as possible. And you'll have things fluttering out of the bushes when you water. And that's what you want. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to run through if we're starting from scratch and we're starting over to create our garden, you want to take a look at your space. You know, you have this outdoor space, a backyard or front yard or whatever, and you decided we're going to put in some native plants, but maybe you're redoing your whole yard. So let's take a look at how that works in terms of getting a design that you live with, that you like, that you can live in and enjoy. Look at everything that's there, your vegetation that's there, existing hardscape. Hardscape means things like patios, walkways, stairs, decks, tennis courts, and whatever. You want to look at utilities, other things like downspouts. Are they disconnected downspouts like this one, where the water just kind of ends up on the concrete there? And then you want to kind of evaluate things for looking for like those warm spots, those shady, cool spots. Where's the glare? Where's the noise coming from? Wind, drainage, slope issues. Are there bad smells? You know, do you have a good sliver of a view that you want to take advantage of? Do you have a change in elevation? All of these things are important aspects to look at, and that will help you in deciding what it is that you want to achieve in developing your native plant garden. So I'm all about function. What do things do? How do people use an area? And so let's think you have a wish list. Let's say you're looking at your backyard and you're saying, okay, I want a place to have outdoor dining. I want to have a barbecue. I want a fire pit. Here's my house. I want a habitat garden. How are these things related to each other? And you know that they're related to each other with these double-ended arrows. Okay, the barbecue is close to the dining table. Fire pit may be a little bit away from the barbecue, a little further away from dining, maybe a little closer to the house. These arrows give you a sense of what the circulation is through the area, because you want to move from area to area, because you want to be out in a space and be able to enjoy it. So look for the relationships between these spaces to understand your circulation and your movement between areas. Once you have your wish list of things that the humans want to do, like dining or tennis or swimming pool or whatever it is, then you can start looking at your site and thinking about how those things might fit. And how do you get things to fit? You have to have a map of your site. A scaled map, that is something that is like maybe 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot. That's what it means to draw to scale. It's critical to have this because then you can estimate quantities of things, you can estimate square feet, and so forth. So this is the map that I drew by hand of the backyard that we just looked at, and this heavier line here is the house. And I drew this heavier line by taking a flexible cloth measuring tape on a reel and then sticking one end here at the fence line, pulling it all the way across, using the house to guide it so it's nice and straight, all the way over to the other fence, and getting a measurement of 70 feet 4 inches. And then along that tape, I noticed that the house was 9 feet 6 inches in. The first window is at 11 feet 9 inches, and so forth. So you measure all of the aspects along the house. I pulled another tape from this corner using the edge of the house here to make sure it was nice and straight, pulling it all the way down to the fence line at the end. I use graph paper when I'm measuring on site. This is 1/8 of an inch square here. So it's super easy to know that you're doing it right, because everything should like close completely if your measurements are straight. So that's super important. Once you're done with that base map, you can throw a piece of this translucent tracing paper over the top, where you now take those functions that you're thinking about. Here's the doors that open outward. Here's the sliding doors over here. Maybe we want the fire pit over here. We've got the dining, the dining over here, and the cooking. There's that great view through here, that little sliver of mountain. Okay, that's a little heart there. So this gives you a sense of what the circulation looks like around the site, and then with kind of a general idea of where vegetation can go. So do your hardscape first, then we figure out the plants. If you want something to look really professional, just some quick design tips here. Consider what works best for your situation. If you have, say, a very modern style house, things with like lines, square angles, some very nice arcs, you know, very clean lines work pretty well. And consider the overall composition. Okay, the relationships between shapes, maybe things line up. Okay, maybe things are on an axis. Okay, you want to avoid sort of these random curves that don't really have a defined end to an arc. You want something that's has a defined arc to it. Okay, and avoid those acute pie-shaped angles that are less than 90 degrees, because those things are a maintenance nightmare. and little pieces of concrete that are pointy like that always break. Um, and then for some harmonious composition, repeat elements. So like this arc here is repeated, but again, at a smaller scale. This square is repeated here by these two smaller squares. So that's a designer's trick to harmonize the design, is to repeat elements, but maybe to repeat them at a different scale. Once you do that, you take another piece of trace paper, throw it over the top. You can see my functional diagram is underneath there. But now I've started to put in shapes, form. Remember, form follows function, right? So they wanted a modern design in their backyard. And so I'm very generally showing patio areas here where the fire pit can go. But this is the first hint about where trees go. You know, trees toward the back of the property, and then maybe some a planter with a tree in the center. So very generally, kind of defining the form until you get to something that is a little bit more defined. You also want to show where some shrub masses are. And this is a great way to plan these things. Larger shrubs toward the back. So throw another piece of trace paper over the top. Show your bigger shrubs towards the back in masses like this. And then the smaller perennials in masses around the edges, some stuff that's maybe lower growing at the edge of the pavement that's not going to spill onto your hardscape. And what's helpful too is if you have outdoor furniture, measure it to make sure that it's going to fit into the site. And here we used graph paper. This is a 1/4 inch equals a foot. You can see I've got a scale there, measuring the various furniture that this particular client had. This is what the concept looks like. This shows basic paving areas with some steps going down. Remember, we had that change in elevation. We took up the change in elevation using a combination of stairs, retaining walls. And this particular client wanted the ability to entertain 100 people if they wanted to. So we've got their giant table. It's going to go underneath a shade structure. Their barbecue area is off here. They can still look back this way, see the mountain. Nice planter over here, fire pit down here, lots of retaining walls for people to sit on, steps to sit on. And from what I've heard, they've had parties there with 100 people in it, and it fits everybody nicely. So, but we're showing the plants kind of conceptually here. Okay. Once we kind of figure out where the big things go, like the trees, then we can go back and decide what trees we want to pick, what shrubs we want to pick. And when we're laying out plants, this is where we're getting more specific. To get the spacing correct, one of the first things I like to think about is if I do a planting area, I want a pathway through there. And you can just generally draw in something so that you can get in between and do some weeding. And then when you have your plant palette, and we'll talk about how to choose those plants for your palette in a moment, find their mature diameter and draw those in your nice scale plan. And you can use a circle template to show the mature diameter. And the way to get the spacing correct for plants, so you know how far apart to space them, is that plants should overlap a little bit or just basically barely touch. And you can do masses of plants like this group of pink ones here, these yellow ones and following a line along there. What you want to do is start with trees first, place those, then your shrubs, and then layer in your perennials, your vines, your bulbs, your succulents, and any annual plants that you want to use. And you can also continue to add more plants over time if you have spaces left. Now, this is what a planting plan looks like that I do as a landscape architect. Your results may vary, but what this does is it shows you, and these are handy to have because then you can give it to a landscape contractor. They can purchase the plants and install them for you, which is a nice thing. And it shows them that there's like 3 of these Jousneria californicas, okay, in a group there, and so forth. And what this does is that it gives you quantities of plants so that you know how many of a species that you need. and how much it's going to cost. You can say, okay, well, each of these cost, as a 1 gallon plant is maybe $10. I can get this as a 4-inch plant for maybe $4. So cost considerations are a thing that you can figure out when you have a good plan. So always get that plan done. Now, that's kind of the mechanics of it. Now the fun stuff. And how do you develop a plant palette? How do you choose what to pick to plant in your native plant habitat, in your pollinator habitat? A lot of it's going to really depend upon, again, what it is that your goals are for that site. Do you need some more shade? Do you want some butterflies? Do you want to see a lot of bees? Do you want to save the planet? I mean, it's a personal thing. It's a commitment, definitely. And why California native plants? Well, we live in one of only about 30 some biodiversity hotspots on the entire planet here in California. We have in California almost 8,000 species of plants, some found nowhere else on the planet. Some are so rare they're only found in 1 or 2 locations in the state. We have approximately 1,600 species of native bees in the state of California. Across the United States, there are 4,000 species. Honeybees are not native, but we have more species of native bees than anywhere else in the United States. And we have such a huge number of native plant species, largely because we have a bunch of unique ecosystems and we have a lot of bees. So small bees do some things, bigger bees do other things, and they live everywhere: deserts, mountains, coastal communities, chaparral, you name it. Okay, and these are all pictures that I've taken in the past of the various organisms that I see in our gardens. So again, why California native plants? So if we plant those non-natives, they can escape cultivation and infest natural areas and destroy natural ecosystems. They can bring in diseases and pests. And planting native keeps California looking like California. And the native plants have evolved to to excuse me, to live in our hot, dry summers and our wet winters. And a lot of species are drought tolerant once they've been established. And so then you go, okay, what do I plant? How do I start? And people are always asking me, usually after I'm done giving these presentations, do you consult? Yes, I do, but try this first on your own. To decide on what to plant, calscape.org is done by the California Native Plant Society. This is a searchable database of all of our 7,990 plants native to California. And you can look at all the plants. And they break it down by all plants, trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, and so forth. Or you can search for specific areas to see what grows in your area. Now, because plants are food, I think a better question rather than what to plant is who to feed. And we know that plant species need pollinators to survive. For pollinated plants, their pollen gets spread around by pollinators. They need that to spread their genetic diversity. Plants don't get up and move and say, here, have some pollen. They rely on insects to do that for them. There are wind pollinated species, but they don't rely on pollinators. The wind does it. But we know that for the flowering plants, speciation, where you have like in a sea of like purple flowers, there'll be one pink one. That kind of speciation, a variation, happens more rapidly when you have pollinators versus wind pollinated things. And what that tells us, amongst other things, is that the biological factors may be more important considerations than abiotic factors, non-biology, like climate or geology or water, for determining what to plant. So the calscape.org site is great. They have a planting guide, which is excellent and goes into a vast amount of detail about how to plant things, how to water things, that I wish I had more time to cover. They tell you about nurseries, where you can find these plants. And a lot of these nurseries have their inventory listed online. You can set up a plant list here, and that can be downloaded as an Excel spreadsheet. So really easy. And then it has butterflies. Okay, what are those larvae that are going to eat your plants? And we have 1,368 butterflies and moths native to California. And I just took a screenshot here of Calscape showing the various things, the various butterflies that we have. And then they show host plants. What are those things that they eat? And as I said before, Calscape has a lot of in-depth information on plant selection, locating the best species for your site, how to establish those plants, irrigation techniques to reduce water use, and so forth. Really a wonderful resource that is free. But where you want to start is you want to start with your keystone plant genera. And what we mean by keystone plant genera are those species that form the backbone of everything, that provide resources for a lot of different other species. So they can form a lot of food resources. They provide shelter and nesting sites, okay? They basically help those other plant species to survive too. And providing food for dozens or hundreds of caterpillar types, and countless other species depend on those caterpillars for protein source. So like here are a couple little baby oaks in my backyard nursery. So a technique here is to try to include a few keystone species in your garden. And you can identify a keystone species based on the number of insects that they host. That's a good way. There are other ways too, via the function of plants in the environment. And like I said before, start with trees first, then shrubs, and then move to the smaller stuff for choosing your plants. It's hard to dig a 15-gallon hole size. So you want to get those in first during our planting season. That runs from about the end of fall to about the middle of May, when the soil is nice and moist and easy to dig. And you want to start with your keystone trees, like this big, beautiful oak that we have here. And trees do a lot of things in the environment. They, of course, they're food. That's how we get these beautiful California sister butterflies. But they also do something else. Their other function is to help form the rain cycle. You probably remember in grade school when they taught you about the rain cycle, how they had the ocean on one side, the mountains on the other, and the water evaporating up off of the ocean, going over as a cloud to the mountains and dropping down as rain. That is only one half of the rain cycle. Trees do the other half because they take in water and release it out through their leaves. So when you don't have trees, this is kind of what you get, kind of a desert landscape here. And they do other things in the environment. They have other functions in terms of filtering rainwater, reducing the impact of water on the ground, reducing flooding, and so forth. And you want to choose a tree that's going to fit in your site. So this is Quercus agrifolia, a coast live oak. And this person here is my 6'3" tall husband. So not really going to work probably in that 10-foot wide side yard. So consider carefully size of the plant that you want to put in your yard. Some people say, well, I really want an oak, but I don't have room. Then you can go with something smaller like a scrub oak, which is a kind of a large shrub. And you can actually grow them in pots, which I have one in my own yard where I don't have room for a full-size oak. I wanted one because I know how good they are as keystone species. So California native trees, how do you decide on a tree for your location? What I like to do, because I want to identify those keystone species, in Calscape, you can rank those plants by the number of butterflies and moths hosted. So here I did a search for Santa Clara County, and it pops up 13 native trees to the county. And, you know, everything from valley oak, and valley oak used to be 61% of the tree cover here in the valley before they were all cut down. And then determine what is going to fit into your space. And you can look at the varieties that are here and make a determination what's going to work best. Look at the mature size, look at the water constraints. You know, is it evergreen? Does it keep its leaves most of the time, or is it deciduous? Does it drop its leaves? You know, these are questions that only you as the homeowner can answer. What do you want? Secondly, choose your keystone shrubs. You know, again, sort the plants by the number of butterflies and moths that are hosted, and then choose what's going to fit for your location and your water needs. You know, what are you looking for? You know, the ceanothus is a wonderful plant that provides a lot of resources, and the flowers are fragrant, they're evergreen, super low water use. You know, many of these plants are very, very low water use. Some of them, like our toyon that we have here, I planted one in my own yard. I never watered it at all, and it's just fine. Um, so, you know, these native plants are really, can be really happy on very little water. Perennials, you can rank them, but really these are ones that we have in our gardens, and they just provide so many resources. They're really just more than you could ever use in a lifetime of plants, which is unfortunate because I want them all. And, you know, they're very attractive to different kinds of these wonderful, beautifully biologically engineered insects that go and feed on them and move genes around in the environment. Annuals, if you want to pop a color early on and just get some filler plants in, and want to spend a tiny amount of money for a lot of color, annuals are a good way to go. An annual plant is one that just lives for 1 year. And as a 1 year plant, it likes to sprout quickly, flower, set seed, and then it dies, and then it usually reseeds. And annuals are great because those are the most under threat natives from competition from non-native grasses, and a huge variety are available as seeds. And there's many other benefits to annuals too, but poppies, super easy, our state flower. So every garden should include a few of those. Gilia capitata, beautiful blue flower that gives you a lot of seeds. So this one can be kind of aggressive in terms of its, I want to be in your garden everywhere. And then Phacelia tenacetifolia has pollen. There's a little bee eating some pollen there on the end of the anther, and nectar source, wonderful nectar source for insects. And annuals are showy. I mean, look at this beautiful Clarkia amoena mix, right? It's like pink and beautiful red, and nectar guides on these flowers telling the bees where the good stuff is. I mean, who wouldn't want that in the garden? It's so pretty and fluffy. And I do a lot of plants from seed because that is a good way to preserve genetic diversity. And seeds can be slow to germinate. So I like to experiment and put them into a wet coffee filter in a plastic bag. I stick it into the refrigerator and check it every few days. Make sure each thing is labeled so you don't forget what's what. And then once I see a root tip come out, I plant it up. And I don't spend very much money on planter pots. Planter pots can be a recycled egg carton. So really doesn't have to be an expensive thing. And you usually get about 1,000 seeds per envelope. So you really don't sow them all unless you want 1,000 plants to deal with. Now, some of the components of native plant design in terms of water saving is that the native plants will form a community amongst their roots and other parts of their growing bits. And they recognize each other and they help each other, and they help each other with moisture, actually. And this is from the calscape.org planting guide, in which they're showing an oak with its deep tap roots going down into the water table, pulling that water up, and then with these ground level lateral roots, with the help of some underground fungus, sharing the water with other plants in that environment. And then I expanded upon this to show that some of the complexity that you want to have in these gardens can be achieved by adding things to the gardens, like swales, okay? So a swale is just a depression where water can then collect and drain back into the ground table. And leaves, you can do piles of leaves in places, and then plants that have runners on their roots, those runners will go to where the moisture is. So you'll have things coming up next to your leaf pile. You can have grasses that have very long roots that go down that actually help channel water down into the environment. And to increase connectivity, I'll plant vines that crawl up through other shrubs and use them as their scaffolding. Rocks are great too because they trap moisture underneath. And because so many things eat tree leaves, their larvae drop down below into leaf litter beneath these trees where there's a lot of moisture and overwinter there. So don't use a leaf blower to blow things out from underneath the trees because that's where a lot of those butterflies are and a few meals for some birds. Okay, so lots of different ways to increase the connections between what's going on underground and what's going on up above, and then also laterally as well. So the more complexity that you put into a garden like this, and you do this over time, it doesn't happen overnight, the more complexity, the stronger it gets and the more resilient it is in terms of climate change. So this is an example of a swale that I designed. And this is underneath a redwood tree, and we've got some nice ferns and boulders, okay? And their downspouts empty into this. So a downspout swale can be really attractive and very natural looking. And for this client, they weren't really sure about this, and now it's their favorite thing. And also, as I mentioned before, plants will put their roots underneath of rocks because it's nice and moist there, and it's a great place to germinate. In terms of pollinator gardens, one of the key things that we have to provide is to provide overlapping bloom times. And you want to do plants that bloom early, mid, and late for pollinators. So early blooming things like the Ceanothus valley violet that I'm showing here blooms in January and February. This is when the black-tailed bumblebee here in Palo Alto comes out. Super critical for these bees to get food right away. And basically, you want to try to have 3 things blooming during the early, 3 things blooming during the mid, and 3 things blooming during the late season for overlapping bloom times, different species. That way you can provide continuous food over the entire year for insects and pollinators. Some easy things to plant, Aster chilensis, super easy, very floriferous, lots of blooms, Grindelia camporum, Eriophyllum confertifolium, Helenium puberulum. As you can see, lots of different kinds of bees. This is a leaf cutter bee, and you can always tell a leaf cutter by the abdomen there where she's collecting the pollen. Asters, like I must stress, are really great. Asters tend to be a late season bloomer. I like to include these into the design because they provide pollen for bees that only feed on asters. Other bees that are generalists, like the bumblebee here, she will feed on a variety of things. Asters are great. So here's a little Melissoides, another leaf cutter over here, and so forth. Here's the garden that we saw. This is the transformation. This was literally one day after they got everything planted. And you can see lots of places for people to sit on these retaining walls. They hadn't put the furniture back in, but that's what that looked like when it was finished. Now, how do you take care of your garden once it's in? Because these are native plants, you're going to see things like larvae. Do not be afraid. Remember, these are what the birds are eating, and the birds will be out there foraging all the time. One of the things to remember about these native plants is that many insects spend their time as an egg or a larva, okay, a caterpillar. The adult stage for many insects, bees included, is all about mating and dying. And that's the whole adult life right there. And it's typically pretty short. Um, some bees, for example, can spend um, months, maybe even years, as a pupa or a larva before they emerge when conditions are right. Some things spend a lot of time as eggs. So um, you have to be just, this is about those behaviors I was talking about when you do a native plant garden or a pollinator garden, is that there's a life cycle that you have to be aware of, and be aware that you have babies. And so nesting is super important. Um, Leaves as mulch, and I cannot stress this enough, leaves are basically ecosystem gold, okay? And if you can get leaves in your environment, don't use a leaf blower and blow them away. Leaf blowers desiccate insects and kill them. They blow them away, and people say, well, where are all the butterflies? They're in the compost bin. Leave your leaves. They encourage that fungal decomposition. Um, you don't need, and I wouldn't even shred my leaves because you might be shredding some larvae. What I do is I rake things underneath of shrubs and plants and let them grow up through the leaves, and that helps keep weeds down as well. And 3 inches deep or less, you know, and if you don't like the way it looks, because it looks messy, sometimes I do this myself. I'll take a little bit of wood chip mulch and do 1 layer thick, okay, of those wood chips so that it looks uniform. Also, nesting. 70% of our native bees nest underground, okay? And this is mind-blowing. Here's a little nest here, a nest entrance. So I try not to walk in areas that we have bee nests, and it's really hard observation. Just keep an eye to see where things seem to be buzzing about above the ground and they disappear. That means they're going underground. And it's usually an area of about 2 feet by 2 feet or so. Again, for these native plants, you know, people say, what do I do about pruning? I don't do a lot of pruning myself because the plants themselves are resources for other things. They're shelter. And so they might pull leaves together like this to hide from other insects that want to eat them, because insects basically are other insects' meals. Here's some katydid eggs over here on a dead branch that had already gone to seed. Didn't cut it down because it has a lot of eggs on it. So I typically prune to get things out of walkways so that people can get through. Otherwise, I just leave things. Old stems can actually work as supports for new growth, and then the new growth comes up and you don't see the old stems anymore. One of the ways that a native garden is actually low maintenance. Don't prune. Pruning is highly overrated. And for a lot of these plants, they have these hollow, pithy stems. I mean, look at this pith here in that hollow area. And this wasp here, who takes care of some bad insects, she's a nice predator, she lives inside here. And that's where she lays her eggs. And inside the stem, you have egg being laid upon egg, being laid upon egg. There are a number of bee species that do that as well. So the tip here is to leave between 8 and 12 inches of stem in place if you are cutting things back, as the insects will create those nest cells from the bottom upwards. And then the new growth covers those up. Again, create complexity in your environment with lots of shelter areas. This is a little leaf cutter bee coming out of one of the bamboo stakes in my own backyard. And then at the Gwynedd Street Garden, we added logs for more nesting spots for bees to add complexity, okay, and more places for them to go. Some people say, well, it looks maybe chaotic. I like to think that it looks complex. Lots of sites, lots of niches, lots of places to hide, lots lot of food to eat. If spaces like that and a diversity of plants, if you can get about 20 native species in your garden to start with, you will have a good balance of food resources for insects to come in, and nothing will get out of balance. And then if you keep adding species, you increase complexity, and you really tighten up the resiliency of that garden so that it's much more it's more stable, and if you lose one species out of it, you still have a very tightly knit web of all the other species that live there. Maintenance, keep the weeds at bay. People always ask me, what about oxalis? What about this or that? I don't use any herbicides, no pesticides, no fungicides, because those things affect larval development. They affect the hormones of developing insects. So you don't want to use those things. I pull things out by hand, and I do a little bit all the time. That way it doesn't become overwhelming. I try to get things before they set seed, yank them out and stick them in the trash or stick them into the compost someplace where the seeds can't get in and wreak havoc on everything. You don't need to fertilize a native plant garden. If your soil is heavy, you know, dig holes during the cool season, maybe mix in a little bit of cactus mix to make it a little bit easier to work with. Um, you can mulch initially to keep the weeds down, let the mulch kind of get eaten by insects in the soil, but then leave some bare ground for insects or bees to get in there and nest. Again, don't use leaf blowers, please. Um, let the annuals dry out, go to seed. If you want to trim them back, I trim them down to maybe about a foot high, let the seeds fall where they may. Or sometimes I will collect them, the seeds, and give them away as presents to people. And so here we have a beautiful yellow-faced bumblebee on Gilia capitata. You can see she's got some nice pollen on her yellow face there. And then, of course, the ongoing decisions, and this is really just the beginning of all these questions. Now that I've figured out my, plants for the early, mid, and late blooming seasons, I want to continue to add more plants because I'm committed to this habitat. So get out there and observe your garden, see what's there, try to support the species that are already there. Ask yourself, when you're adding plants, does this plant provide forage for local insect species? Is it a keystone species? How much water is needed? Does this plant provide nesting opportunities? Is it hard to grow from seed? Is it hard to grow in general? Will this plant enhance pollinator resources in the garden? Let's say you don't have enough plants blooming late in the season. Remember, we want 3 each for early, mid, and late. That's the minimum. And if you can do these masses, and masses about 3 feet thick, so that 3 feet wide, so that pollinators can spend a lot of time in one area foraging on one plant, that's more efficient for them. Okay, instead of just having one of each, have a big mass of things. A mass or an abundance is really good because for bees, for some species, it takes all the pollen from 1,000 flowers to make one bee. So more is better than less. You want large masses of blooming things, 3 species, early, mid, and late, large masses. Okay, that makes it more efficient for the bees to forage. And that's what I mean by enhance the pollinator resources, to provide abundant resources for food, for shelter, for nesting spaces. And then ask yourself, how connected is this garden to other natural spaces? Do you live next to a park? Do you live next to a community garden? What do you see that's flying around already? Look at your neighbors' yards. What do they have? And maybe they don't have very many bees or butterflies or anything flying around. Okay, so these are all considerations when deciding what to plant. And I always like to look closely before acting because, again, with a pollinator garden, with a native plant garden, these plants are food. Basically, when you plant native plants, you are setting a buffet out for the natural insect world, and they will come. This is a guarantee. You can't set a table full of yummy things to eat and nothing shows up. Trust me, they will. So, you know, be committed to the plants and to the insects that live there by knowing that they have a life cycle. So um, look and see what they're doing before deciding on something. You know, the insect scale, their world is very small compared to ours. So observation, which I like to call enjoying the garden, it's key. And here I was taking a picture with my macro lens of this beautiful Silene, and it was only later that I noticed this little tiny juvenile katydid. So she saw me, or he saw me, before I saw it. And so that's what I mean. It's a matter of perspective. So I try to be very careful and gentle with the garden while providing abundant resources, complexity, and food for the entire year. And with that, once you set your buffet up and you're in the garden, you can just enjoy it and see what happens, because it becomes not only your home, but it becomes home for everything else. And that is the broad strokes of a pollinator garden. I'd be happy to take any questions now.
Yay, I'm giving you a round of applause on you. That was so great. I really enjoyed that. I loved your references of the buffet. I loved the one in the beginning about inviting all the guests.
Yes.
And I also loved your point about how native plants keep California looking like California, and how many statistics you shared with us about how many native plants there are and native bees and everything. So that was really interesting. So we do have a couple questions coming in. Everyone feel free to keep submitting your questions. We'll see if we can get through them in the next 30 minutes or so. So keep submitting them. I do believe we have one hand raised. Let me check on that. Oh, nope, not anymore. All right, so I'm going to start with this first question. Bill says, we have bees bliss sages that have grown larger than references said that they were and were allowed for. They're
Yes.
growing over the sidewalk and also encroaching on other plants. We have to prune them at least twice a year because of this. Would you recommend certain times to do the pruning? Maybe not so rainy, not too hot. There's a two-part question, so let's start with that bit.
Yes, so I have the same problem. The Salvia bees bliss we planted at the Primrose Way garden, and they weren't supposed to become like 10 to 15 feet across, but they did. They're obviously happy. And I prune those out of the street because they grow right over the curb and into the street. So I prune them back. And I do that after they're done blooming. You know, I want the resources to be there, and they're kind of thugs. They like to crawl on top of other plants. So I will come in with my hand pruners and trim them away after blooming, um, or even before they start blooming, away from other plants. Um, but yes, they can, I mean, I don't know what's the maximum size of these plants are really, a half an acre. You know, it's like worse than bamboo almost.
Sounds like it. And there was another part to Bill's question. He said, in your experience, do bees bliss sages or other ground covers mound higher in the middle of the plant because of the pruning along the edges?
You know, that's a good question. I've noticed that they do mound higher in the middle, and I don't know why that is. That just might be a habit of how they grow. Um, you know, I have a theory about how plants move across the landscape, and it's like, you know, how the roots, the branches will develop roots as they spread out, and sometimes the center dies, so it's kind of like they're like walking by spreading roots out and just like moving down the street, which I think is very strange. I don't know what causes that mounding in the center. Certainly if something gets a little high in the center, you can prune it back. um, I I wouldn't do too much pruning in the middle there unless it like looks dead in some areas when everything else looks alive. Some plants, as you know, California native plants, some of them, not all of them, will look a little dry and dead during the heat of summer. It's like, don't fall for it because they're only dormant in active growth phases, and there are places that are obviously dead because they snap. Feel free to go ahead and prune those out, but I don't know if it's because you trim them at the edges.
Okay. Okay. Good to know. Thank you. Next question from Michael. Any recommendations for a low ground cover that's drought tolerant or low maintenance? Colors would be a plus.
Could you say that again? You froze up for a second.
Oh, sorry. Any recommendations for a low ground cover that's drought tolerant or low maintenance? Colors would be a plus.
Oh, so yeah, everybody loves ground covers. One that I like to use is yarrow, Achillea millefolium, which goes a little bit dormant, but it's always there in the soil, and you can walk on it. And they will send up a sprig that can be white blooming. You can get them in pink and shades of red. That's a great low growing ground cover. And the fun thing about that is that you can tuck other plants inside of it. So you can have things popping up through there like a meadow almost. I like the Achillea for that reason, because I think it forms kind of like a matrix in which other things live. And then they form that relationship that I was talking about to get that resiliency going on. They help each other. Also, another thing that you might try is Scutellaria californica, which is a ground cover that spreads by runners. It really depends on what the site is like. If it's moist and shady, you could use Viola adunca, which is there's a variety that we have at the Primrose Garden that grows between stepping stones. It's very low, but it has the sweetest little purple blossoms. And it's also a larval food source for one of our native butterflies.
Great. Thank you for those recommendations. Next question, this one is from Phil. What native milkweed species do you suggest for monarch butterfly resources?
Well, so this is a great question, and it comes up a lot. And the Asclepias fascicularis, the narrow-leafed one, is the one that's local to this area. I like to provide a couple of different kinds of milkweeds generally. The Asclepias speciosa, the showy milkweed, I like it because it has really big leaves on it. And the flowers smell like roses, actually. And if you raise monarchs, a big leaf is much easier to feed them. And this is what I do occasionally. I will raise a few monarchs at home. And then for the attraction of the monarch, what's helpful is to plant your cluster of milkweed at the edge of the habitat. There's a study that was done showing the placement of milkweed makes a difference in terms of whether it gets used or not. When it's in a clump at the edge rather than in the middle of something, it's easier for these not very big brained insects to find. And also, if you can plant something very bright and colorful around it, something that's shocking pink or something like that, to really stand out and say, I'm open for business here. Those are some things that can help get that milkweed noticed. Couple species, edge placement, colorful companion plants.
Nice. All right, I like that. And that was the Acacia milleflori, you said?
Asclepias?
Asclepias. I'm trying to make sure I chat these
Okay.
the names of these. Asclepias.
Asclepias, and that's the genus Asclepias, and then the species. You could do Speciosa or fascicularis. There are several other kinds of milkweeds. People say try to plant what's local to your area. And I like to go somewhat outside of our area because I like other types of things, and so it's like at the buffet. You don't just want one type of salad. You want like 3 or 4 salads. And that's what these plants are. Think of it as a salad bar.
I like that. I like that metaphor. All right, next question. This one's from Crystal. Are there any considerations when a native garden is intermixed with non-native trees already existing and edibles?
Right. Existing trees are great. They provide scaffold for native vines, so you can use those non-native trees as supports for those things, as well as places to maybe hang some bird houses or bee habitats, um, and use the shade that they provide as well. Um, you know, and so like, for example, over at the Island Drive Garden, the big gigantic tree in the middle is not a native. And we have over 70 species of native plants planted underneath of it. So I don't know how this tree feels like about that. It does drop branches occasionally. I usually wear a hard hat when I'm working over there. Um, but that shouldn't that should not stop you. Um, Consider the lifespan also of the tree. Is it going to need to be replaced at some point in time, and maybe get something started to replace it and keep that succession and the forest cover
Right.
going.
Okay, good to know. You're full of good tips. All right, we have one more question in the queue. So if anyone has any lasting ones, feel free to raise your hand, type in the Q&A really quick. We still have a couple more minutes for questions. So this one says, I have several native plants now I have had several native plants now for a few years. My questions are how to maintain them. Some are looking a little scraggly, some are very healthy, and I'm wondering how to maintain them, trim them back, prune, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what the species that you have. Some are relatively short-lived plants. Some of the perennials are biennials, meaning they last for 2 years. Other plants are, you know, there's like 7 years tops. Ceanothus species, it would be great if they would last like 50 years, but, maybe 10 to 12 years for a ceanothus before you have to replace it. Um, it depends on what the species is. Maybe it needs to be pruned back severely because it's fire adapted and needs to have a really good pruning. Um, so I would investigate on Calscape what the normal lifespan is, if you can find that information. If it's getting towards the end, it might be time to refresh the garden with some new things.
Okay, great. And just so everyone knows, I did drop the link for Calscape in the chat. So if you'd like to check that out, the link is available. All right, next question, another one came in. Bill says, we planted a black sage from a 4-inch pot less than a year ago on a mound in our backyard with good drainage, full sun in Livermore. It grew very quickly and is about 5 foot in diameter and 3 to 4 feet tall. About a month ago, on the plant's north side, 4 large soft stems were laying on the ground, all broken off near the crown. A few days later, we found some large stems in the middle of the sage coming off a lateral branch, also fallen over, broken. We don't see evidence of any animals. Any idea why this happened? Did the stems just get too large and heavy? What do you think?
Um, it could be that they were too large and heavy. It could be squirrels, which are notorious. Remember that animals do come out at night as well, so maybe there were some skunks out there fighting, or doing skunk things. Possums, certainly, raccoons. You know, uh, it could even be birds landing in there. Big heavy bird coming in, and because once you have a habitat garden, um, the food chain gets activated, so things will be coming in. So it might be animals. One thing I do recommend with watering is not to water directly on top of the crown of the plant, but around sort of the um, drip area of the foliage there, just so that you don't get any sort of rot in the center. Um, yeah, I mean, when you have branches breaking off, you may be able to start some cuttings with those. So that's an opportunity to get more going. So that's another way to increase your sage quantity.
Sure. All right, sounds good. Okay, so we do not have any more questions in the Q&A, no hands raised, so this will be our final call for any questions for Juanita to answer live. And as I said, the recording will be available in a couple days on the Bosca website, so you can always revisit this presentation if you have any questions. So,
Yes, Albany, one thing I would recommend for people to do is to check out some really excellent books on native plants and pollinator gardens. There's one that's really good called California Bees and Blooms, which has a lot more specific information about this. Um, Native plant gardens, there's the books by uh, Dr. Doug Tallamy, Nature's Best Hope. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, and he talks a lot about the specificity of insects feeding on native plants. Those are great ones. And on my social media, I'm always posting the books that I'm reading for people for more information. Um, and I would also recommend people to maybe check out some of my other pollinator talks that I've done for Bosca, which go into um, details about what bees eat in terms of what they like in terms of what nectar provides, what pollen provides. There's just a wealth of information there. And the more that you know about what you're seeing really just enhances your enjoyment because it's like, oh, that's why that's happening, or oh, that's what that's doing, and form then you form your own resilient relationship because the more you know, right?
right, absolutely. And we can find those recordings also on the Bosca website of some of your previous talks.
I believe so. And
Perfect.
yeah, and some of the other cities that I've done talks for as well. I've also done talks for the California Native Plant Society, and those talks are available online as well.
Great. All right, I'm gonna drop the name of that really quick. Sweet. All right. Well, thank you for the plethora of information and resources. I think we all have a lot that we'll be thinking about for the next couple weeks when we're starting our spring gardens. All right. Well, if no one has any lingering questions, then we will wrap it up for the evening. So, Juanita, thank you again so much for joining us. You had such an interesting presentation, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it just as much as I did. So, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Albany.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good rest of your evening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.